Okay, why don't we get started? I'm Susan Sherwin, Executive Vice President of Development at the Aspen Institute. I'm so sorry that Walter Isaacson, our President and CEO, could not be with us today. So he sends his regrets and special welcome. But it's our great honor and privilege to have Ambassador Young with us today, and he will be interviewed by Kabir Sehgal. And there's a wonderful story, a lot of which will come out in the conversation. But we all know the wonderful life that Ambassador Young has led, minister, writer, consultant, mayor, author, ambassador, diplomat, so many important roles to play. And I hope you will be able to cover a little bit of that. It's such a privilege to have you here and to learn more about what you've done. I might just say, though, about Kabir that he, as a second grader, had the boldness to go to Ambassador Young, and at that time as mayor of Atlanta, and ask for an interview and I hope he'll tell some of that story, for a second grade paper, and thus began a long and wonderful friendship, which has come into a book, which we encourage you to buy, which we think make wonderful Christmas presents. So we welcome you, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Would you like to? Yeah, sure.
Let me start by saying that he did come in and call as a second grader, and I really had not met him, but his father had introduced me to the Indian ambassador. His father had introduced me to the Indian ambassador, Ambassador Ricky Jaipal, who had been at the United Nations almost from the beginning and was a good friend of Ralph Bunche. And Ambassador Jaipal kind of adopted me at the UN and sort of, helped me to know who's who and what's what, so that I had a mentor at the United Nations, which gave me a different point of view from the things that I was getting from the State Department, and meant that I did almost everything successfully there. In the sense that most of our executives, our State Department people, are there for a very short time. And like any other political institution, more than most political institutions, the United Nations is a big family. And if you don't know who's who and what's what, it's hard to get things done. And so that he came with some credentials. But from then on, we've just had an active dialogue about anything and everything. And it was his idea to turn it into a book, and asked me if I would mind taping it. And since I wasn't running for anything and I didn't want anything, I figured it was easy to tell him the truth, and to hell with the consequences. So why don't you go ahead and...
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of people say when they read the book, they said it's very jarring, his honesty and his comments, and he uses a lot of salty language. And I didn't really think about turning this into a book until I was in college. We spoke for many years, and then on my college graduation day, Ambassador Young and his wife came to my graduation up in Hanover, New Hampshire, and he gave me a letter. And he said, I want you to read this letter when you're by yourself. I said, okay. I looked in the letter. I thought it would be money. There was no money. So he's always said it's better to have rich friends than to be rich yourself. But he said in the letter, he said, Kabir, you're great, you're talented, you're going to go on to do great things. But it's really, at the end of the letter, it was very fascinating to me, and I always remember this. He says, you can really get anything done you want as long as you give other people credit, as long as you give other people credit. And we kind of started talking and doing these conversations, and one of my good kind of advisors and friends, Doug Brinkley, the historian, he said, you have a great relationship with Ambassador Young, if you put this book together, you need to be very concerned, though. And I said, why do we have to be concerned? He says, well, by the time you're done with this book, you're going to have a lot of enemies. And you're going to be attacked by the New York Times. You're going to be attacked by all the people who attacked him. And he's very outspoken. And I found that was actually a place where I could start asking Uncle Andy some questions as to why this happened and why he's perceived this way. And that was kind of how, in this book, we talk about many things, but I think the most important thing where I like to start is you really can't get through a conversation with Ambassador Young if every single topic is about money, meaning that the civil rights, the current markets, politics, he always brings it back to jobs and money, and what's so important is creating the new opportunities for people. So let me ask you real quick, how do you see economics as part and parcel of the civil rights movement, and did you get where you wanted to be while you were in the 60s?
Well, you know, the civil rights movement came directly out of the church. And the question you're going to be asked in the judgment, according to the New Testament, Matthew in the 25th chapter, is did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you heal the sick? Did you set at liberty those who are oppressed? And what we were doing in the 60s, we thought of as religious. And yet, Martin Luther King was the one who said, you know, I admire the Good Samaritan, but I don't want to be one. And it's an argument that we're still having and that I'd love to have with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and what's the other fellow's name who's giving away all the billions?
Mark Zuckerberg is now.
Yeah. But I'm saying that he said, I don't want to pick up people by the side of the road after they've been beaten up and robbed. I want to change the Jericho Road. And I listened last night to his speech, one of his last speeches, Where Do We Go From Here? And he was reaffirming there that the problem was how to generate jobs, how to grow an economy that included all of America. And he had, by that time, he had begun to think of all of the world. And he'd begun to relate the troubles in Venezuela and Colombia and Latin America and South Africa all to poverty more than to politics. And it's why I just decided, forgive me, Bill Coleman, but I just said to all of the kids who are going into trying to be lawyers, I don't write recommendations to law school anymore. Because I think what happened in the Thurgood Marshall, Bill Coleman era, the problems were legal. And the theory was that we would change the Constitution so that it would include us in all of the rights and privileges and responsibilities of American citizenship. We did a pretty good job of that, and then they changed the rules in the middle of the game. They changed it so that now economics is the thing that excludes us. You can be included in the politics, but still excluded from the economic order. And so I've been saying that young people who want to do for America what Thurgood Marshall and Bill Coleman and others did need to figure out how we break down the economic walls that create, classes and restrict opportunities on the basis of money.
Is that why you chose the method of boycotts to strike?
Yeah, the boycott was, and it was the difficulty that we had. The NAACP had been strictly with the courts, and we felt that was wonderful, and we couldn't have done it without them, but that in Birmingham, for instance, you had 300,000 African Americans out of a city of about 650,000, 700,000. if they stopped buying anything but food or medicine for 90 days, Birmingham would have to change. It would paralyze the economy. And so everybody sees the dogs and the fire hoses, and they get upset with me when I said that was the fun part. I mean, on a hot day to get hosed down by fire hoses was like, it was like a fraternity party or something. And nobody was really afraid of the dogs. In fact, there were actually dogs killed in Birmingham because they wouldn't back off from the dogs, and they had knives and they had ice picks and things like that subtly, which we didn't know about till later. But the boycott with 300,000 people withholding their money for just one business cycle, 90 days, was what caused people to sit down and talk. And that became my job, to engage in negotiations with the business leaders and work out a strategy to get the black community back into the business world. And the conditions were very simple, that you employ people. There were maids in these department stores who knew more about the department stores than the people who were selling the clerks. We said, all you have to do is let the maids wear the clothes they're selling, and instead of calling them maids, let them be sales clerks and give them a commission. Well, that was easy to do, and it actually increased their business, because most of the people who were going into the stores, including the white people, knew that the maids knew more about what was on sale and what was going to be on sale. And they had been there 10, 12 years, so they had very good relationships. And so it meant that people did well, and the business improved.
When I was deciding what to do with my life, Uncle Annie said, listen, if you want to help the poor, if you want to go cure poverty, I was thinking about moving to New Orleans, helping with the Katrina relief. He said, if you want to help poor people, go work in an investment bank. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, let me tell you a story. You know that speech, the I Have a Dream speech that we all know about? It was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. And Dr. King went, and before he did that rhetorical flourish, I have a dream, he said, the American Negro was given a check, and he took that check to the Bank of Justice, and it was marked insufficient funds. He used a financial metaphor. And as a corollary to what you're saying about not wanting to be a good Samaritan, I was just reminded the other day that Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, called investment banking God's work. Do you see high finance and investment banking as God's work?
I really do. But God's work is also defiled by a lot of sinners, including pastors of churches. That's the good thing about Christianity. You are a sinner, but you're a forgiven sinner. And in spite of your weaknesses, you can still do good and serve. And you don't have to be perfect. That's a mistranslation of the New Testament, but we don't need to get into that. What I was basically saying, and I had this fight with my daughter first, after she got involved in law school, and was tutored by Bill Coleman. I was at the UN, and we had dinner with the former Secretary of State, who was General Counsel of Merrill Lynch. And he offered her a job as a lawyer in Merrill Lynch. And she said she wanted to be in poverty law. I said, that is poverty law. I said, what you have to do, and what I'm trying to do in the last few years of my life, whatever they are, is to find a way to get hedge funds to feed the hungry. And that means, and I was up in Leesburg Sunday night, because I think General Marshall and the Marshall Plan, which was not a complicated document, it was a 2-page speech which changed the world. But it by and large was a military man talking economics as the means of European recovery. And it was the investment strategy to rebuild our enemies. He understood that the failure to honor the League of Nations had led to inflation and unemployment and fascism in Germany. And so he didn't want to fight wars. And the way to prevent them is to do what we did with Germany and with Japan. I mean, they are our most reliable allies. Even China, whether we like it or not, is our most reliable ally because we owe them the most money. With the Marshall Plan, we put out the money, but we made money back. And it stabilized the global economy from 1944 right on up to 74. And then we made a shift, and we still have not fully adjusted to it.
So coming back, how did you get involved with the civil rights movement? Was it a plan? Was it something you set off to do from an early age?
No, as I said, my father was a dentist, and he brainwashed me until all the way through school that I needed to be a dentist and a baseball player. And I didn't play baseball because I grew up in the city. He grew up in the country in Louisiana. But he was a very forceful man, a very loving man, and we only had one conflict in our life. Only once did he get mad with me in all the years, and he only died recently. And that was when I told him, I'm sorry, I'm going to seminary. I'm not going to dental school. And he said, well, you're on your own. He said, all the preachers I know are either poor or crooked. And I don't want you to be either, so you have to make this step on your own. And it was probably the best thing that happened to me because I went on up to Connecticut and got into seminary and got a little scholarship and had 3 or 4 jobs. And for the first time in my life, really in a small Protestant United Church of Christ based, New England-based Puritan school that had the freedom to think about and do anything. We were also the headquarters of a lot of the missionary training, so there were students there that I studied with and worked with from just about every continent on earth. So it was, that was a very good preparation. But I went to a little country church in South Georgia. And one of the first, I was 21, I think. And it was Mother's Day. And I was about to preach on the Christian family. And one of the mothers of the church and one of the deacons of the church had a fight that Saturday night. And I'd already fixed up my sermon, and did I back out? And then in talking about it, because here was a guy who didn't drink, who came home drunk. And then I realized that he'd been working as a caretaker on this plantation most of his life. He was in his 50s. He'd been working there at least 25, 30 years. A young white man came, and he was training him to be his boss. And when they got paid, he got $45, and the white boy got $75. And there was nothing he could do about it but, go out and try to drown his sorrows. Well, his wife didn't allow drunks in her house, and she was trying to brush him out with the broom, and trying to take the broom from her and defend himself. He got hit upside the head, and she had a patch on her eye. And so how do you preach about a Christian family like that? And suddenly it dawned on me that it didn't matter what I preached to them about being God's children if the society was structured to make them second-class citizens and to keep them inferior and humiliate them, it was a waste of time. And part of the book of Ephesians talks about breaking down the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Greek is one of the roles of Jesus' ministry. And it just suddenly opened up to me that we had to break down the dividing wall of hostility between black and white. And it was Frederick Douglass who said, the struggle for freedom is a struggle to save black men's bodies and white men's souls. Excuse me. And it just led naturally into the boycott. That was 1954, and the Montgomery boycott started in 55. Later on, well, I don't know, somewhere along in there. It started, well, I just celebrated the Montgomery bus boycott, but it was the Mother's Day before December, so that was probably June. I was sort of ready to start looking at the South in a new way, still being religious, and still seeing it as a religious calling. And that's how I ended up. And when Martin was killed, I saw our role as community organizers, and that my job was, as we had organized campaigns for nonviolent boycotts and the like, that we had to begin to organize campaigns to run people for Congress and organize labor unions. Nobody wanted to run. And so it was really, I was meeting with Harry Belafonte, who was doing some fundraising for us, and I said that Julian Bond had decided he couldn't run, and Vernon Jordan had taken the job with the United Negro College Fund and had moved to Washington. And so Harry didn't say a word. He just turned around and dialed his wife and said, see if you can find a day when Sidney Poitier and Lena Horne and maybe Alan King, we were going to do some things together, and find a date at the Pierre Hotel in New York. We're going to have a dinner. And she must have said, what for? And he said, Andy's running for Congress. I mean, that's the way that happened. It was not pre-planned, and I still thought I would have been better off getting others to run, and but you know, then Carter, somebody asked him about Africa, and he really didn't know, and he called me up and invited me over to the governor's mansion, and it was simple. They asked him about Azania, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, and we were not using those terms in 1975, even except for African scholars. And I said, well, that's South Africa and Rhodesia. And he said, oh my God, you know. And I said, the answer is very simple. One man, one vote. Democracy, you know, and everybody, let everybody out of jail and have a democratic election and do what we did in the South. Well, he understood that instinctively. And so when he got elected, he asked me to go to the United Nations because he said, and I was trying to get him to appoint Barbara Jordan because I thought she would be the perfect UN ambassador. And I knew she had arthritis and was having trouble staying in the Congress. But he said, no, I need somebody who was with Martin Luther King. And he said, if we're going to be serious about human rights, you know, nobody's going to believe us. We've got too bad a record. And sure enough, Kissinger had been denied the right to land in Nigeria because he'd been to South Africa. Right after I got appointed, I had to go to South Africa, and I was coming back to Nigeria. And I didn't realize that there was a big question as to whether they would let me land.
What did the Nigerian newspapers say?
The Nigerian newspaper headline was, "Send a nigger to catch a nigger." And they said, if the United States thinks that by sending a black man to pursue the same policies, he is no more welcome than Kissinger. And they said, but since he was with Martin Luther King, we decided to let him come and see and hope that he has a different message. Well, of course I had a different message. But that's, the way I got there.
When we got the book back, there was a picture of Andy Young and Dr. King, and it wasn't very good. And I asked Uncle Andy, I said, do you have a better picture of yourself with Dr. King? And he said, well, no, I don't, because even though I was his assistant, there weren't a lot of pictures of me with Dr. King. And that underscored what he said to me earlier about give other people credit. And what he just said, he kind of reluctantly ran for Congress, reluctantly ran for mayor. He was really a number 2 and did it so well that people wanted him to be the number 1. And we value his leadership so much in Atlanta. What I thought was very revealing was the role he played in Dr. King's inner circle. And we talk a lot about the need to be contrarian and to push people and to provoke people. In fact, one of the takeaways I've had from our discussions is it's okay to question and provoke your mentors because they're challenging you for a reason. They can be your ventriloquist for so long, but eventually you need to form your own opinions and your own voice. What was it that Dr. King said to you? Can you share that story about when he got mad with you?
Well, he used to say that you've got to be seriously maladjusted to do what we're doing. In fact, he said, you got to be downright crazy. And he said, most of us are in some way or other. And he said, your problem is you're too well adjusted. And so I was always catching flack as Uncle Tom because I was always trying to be, trying to have a reasoned direction. And I wasn't anxious to get to jail. I didn't see any, I didn't see any point in bragging about how many times you've been to jail. That wasn't what I was interested in. Or I wasn't interested in getting beat up. I had no martyr complex. But half of the people in our staff did. Hosea Williams had been in the Second World War. He'd been in a foxhole, and everybody in the foxhole was killed but him. And when he came back to Georgia on crutches, he drank from a water fountain that said white. Now, he didn't drink from it. He went and he bought a cup and came out and got a cup to get a cup of water. And he was roughed up by some young hoodlums in uniform on crutches for getting water from a white fountain. And he decided that God had saved him to fight for his people. And I used to think Jose was always trying to get himself killed. And I wasn't interested in that, and Martin wasn't interested in that. But Martin understood that every time he took a move and made a decision, his life was at risk. And you had a lot of people with a lot of emotional agendas. And one day I just got tired of arguing with him. And I said, okay, that's good. Count me in. And he stopped the meeting and he said, I need to go run to the restroom. Come with me, Andy, come on. And he got me in there and cussed me up and down. He said, look, if you're going to agree with them, I don't need you. He said, what I need you to do is to come down as far on the right as possible. And you know they're going to be way out here on the left. And I need you to give me enough room so that I can come down somewhere in the middle and we can have a rational discussion that everybody agrees with. And he said, if you're not going to play your role, you better go find you another job. And so, that was a good decision-making process, but it confirmed to me, I was doing it instinctively, but it confirmed to me that it was appreciated and necessary. So I tended to do the same thing in the Carter administration, and I tend to do the same thing on the boards that I serve on. I don't ever mind asking the dumb question that nobody wants to ask.
Do you think that, now, John Lewis said that when Martin Luther King said, "I had a dream," he was partly talking about Barack Obama becoming president. Now, I know you disagree with that, but I want you to answer that, but I also want you to talk about, do you think that Obama has appointed the proper amount of contrarian counsel in his inner circle? We've heard about the team of rivals. Has he done that?
No, and I think that if Martin had thought, if I had said to him or John on the road from Selma to Montgomery that we wanted to be congressmen, he would have said, look, you all have been in the sun too long. It's not going to be that easy. Maybe our children will go to Congress, but we're going to have a lot more difficult struggle. Because Obama did not come out of the civil rights movement. Hillary Clinton came out of the civil rights movement. I mean, Hillary Clinton was down in Mississippi with Marion Edelman in the 70s, so, with my wife and my daughter in the Children's Defense Fund. Now, that doesn't mean I'm against him, but it meant that the natural heir to what we were doing, the person whom I knew and was closest to, and I did not know Barack Obama, and the only reason I would have been supporting him was because he was black, and I just didn't, that was not enough of a reason. And
he said President Clinton may be more black.
Well, I got in trouble for trying to define what's black. But that kept me, I mean, because I was contrarian and I was rather flip about the way I said it, the Hillary Clinton folk were afraid to invite me into the campaign. So it kept me more or less neutral, which I decided later on, because, and this is the economics of the book. I never took a course in economics, but I ended up on the banking committee because we were building an airport, which Bill Coleman helped us build, in Atlanta, the busiest and best airport in the world still, and we were we were trying to make it an international city. Mm-hmm. And that put me on the banking committee because of the airport and I mean, it was urban construction. But I was sitting in the International Finance Committee when Arthur Burns, Paul Volcker, and George Shultz came to say that the Bretton Woods agreements needed to be ended. And I leaned over to Ed Koch and I said, what's the Bretton Woods agreements? And he leaned over to the next person and what's the Bretton Woods agreements? And honestly, most of the people on the banking committee were lawyers. Nobody really knew much economics except Henry Royce, who was an economics professor, and he was impressed with the three great, economic minds that were there. And he said, I suspect you're right. I suspect it's, and he talked about all of the good things that had been done under the Bretton Woods agreements. We'd had a stable global economy for 30, 40 years, and everybody had profited, and I couldn't see why they wanted to end it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But nobody asked any questions, so I said, if the dollar isn't tied to something, and if we don't have some financial agreements, aren't people going to play politics with our currency? And Arthur Burns took a puff on his pipe and said, young man, you'll soon learn that the dollar does not need you to defend it. Well, two things. One, in 60 days, oil was $2.50 to $3 a barrel. In the next 3 months, it was up to about $14, $15 a barrel, then $30 a barrel. And then we've been on an oil roller coaster, and it seemed to me, and I don't know any economics, but common sense says we left a stable gold standard, which we controlled, and we went on an oil standard, which is a roller coaster that nobody controls except not even the people with oil. And so it just seemed like that didn't make sense, and I didn't know why they did it. We didn't get a chance to go back and revisit that because Watergate broke shortly after. And we never went back to discuss it. Now, 25 years later, Paul Volcker writes a book, title of which is Changing Fortunes, where he says that he and George Shultz and Arthur Burns had not discussed that before coming to the Banking Committee, that they had received notice from the White House that they were to testify at the Banking Committee on the end of the Bretton Woods agreements. Well, who decided? And we never found that out, except I suspected that Milton Friedman was in the room. And that just before that, again, I was testifying, Nixon had put on wage price freeze. And nobody liked that, Democrats or Republicans for a while. So I was testifying in behalf of Delta because they were trying to give a 6.5% raise to all of their workers, and Nixon had a 4.2% cap. None of this did I understand what or why. But in trying to understand it, it didn't make sense. And I couldn't get anybody to get it to make sense with me. And I think throughout the Carter administration, people never understood, the economists never understood the difference between a Bretton Woods agreement under the economics of John Maynard Keynes and what happened after Nixon, and especially, well, it was really not only fully implemented under Ronald Reagan, when Reaganomics was really Milton Friedman economics. So we don't know that the rules, the Democrats right now still don't realize that the same rules under which they grew up are no longer relevant in the thinking of most financiers today.
So when you see Jesse Jackson and others doing boycotts, do you think that's an antiquated strategy to bringing about change?
No, I don't think it's antiquated strategy to bringing about change in a specific situation. See? But again, we said that Martin Luther King really was one of the first macroeconomists. And if you read his speech on Vietnam, and there's a book, little book, Call to Conscience, that has introductions by a number of people, and then if you download it on iTunes, you hear Martin Luther King's speech. And last night I listened to the speech he gave at Riverside for the first time in 25 years, and then I listened to the speech he gave, Where Do We Go From Here? It was introduced by Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy's talking about a completely different world and a completely different set of values than those that prevail in the body politic now. And so that's the reason I tell kids to study some economics so they can know. I mean, it's like they're playing football and we're playing rugby. We don't have any pads on, and we don't block below the knees, and I mean, we're playing a different game, and we don't even know the rules of the game that's being played, and it's not Democrat and Republican. Larry Summers is clearly on the wrong side, on a different side from me. See? And the criticism I had of the advisors, and that's where we started this, was that there's nobody there that's poor. There's nobody there that's from the South. In fact, the only person in that inner circle that's had a family that had a job was Michelle. And her family was a working class family. Well, I don't know. But I think that at the same time I say that, I come to the conclusion that the only answer to the present economic situation is going back to something like Bretton Woods, The only difference is it can't be just the Europeans that are making the decisions. The Europeans don't have any clout, their economies are not doing well, and nobody thinks white is right anymore. And to get a global agreement, you're going to have the Chinese, you're going to have Indians, you're going to have Africa, you're going to have Latin America. And in his DNA, you know, God played a trick on us. He got us a president who's got an African father, but he didn't know him. And he's very little African about Barack Obama, and he doesn't know much about Africa. His mother's a good, solid Midwesterner, and he's got all the best that Harvard and Columbia and Chicago can give him. But when in his young years, his mother moved to Indonesia, and he lived for a while in his mother married a Chinese family in the largest Muslim country in the world. Now, the reason I was given the job that I was given in SCLC was because of the way I was born. I was born in New Orleans with an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another, and the German-American Bund, the Nazi party, was 50 yards from my house. And so at 4 years old, I was listening to people Heil Hitler and sing Deutschland über alles, and my father had to explain racism to me before I went to kindergarten. And he said, look, as a physician, a dentist, he said, look, racism is a sickness. You don't get angry with sick people. You find ways to help them, see? And this is a sickness. And he took me to see Jesse Owens in 1936 Olympics films, the movie, and he said, see, you don't argue about white supremacy. You just get out there and prove that it's not the case. And the movie, I'll never forget, Hitler stormed off the platform mad, rather than shake Jesse Owens' hand and give him his 4 Olympic gold medals. I think that's, I had a national view that helped me relate to all kinds of people, and then went to public schools, which was, my neighborhood school was called the Bucket of Blood, Valina C. Jones School. And I figured I could outrun and outfight everybody in my neighborhood because Joe Louis and Jesse Owens were black, and I was black, so I wasn't intimidated, see? But I was black and kind of middle class. And then I went to Valina C. Jones School, and everybody was black and poor. And they were meaner than me, and they could probably run faster than me. So I had to become an ambassador. And I learned to keep my money from being beaten up and taken from me. I had to figure out, look, they're not going to let me eat lunch if they don't have lunch. So we had to figure out a way to pool. In those days, you had bottles. You could sell bottles and turn them in, coat hangers. So I'd get everybody organized to bring something. And then by the time I got something from my parents, my regular lunch money, and then hit my grandmother, my uncle up for a few, about every couple of times a week, we could have enough money to have a loaf of bread, nickel of bologna, nickel of cheese, big RC cola, and a moon pie. And half a dozen of us could eat. To me, that's a metaphor of how we're going to get along in the world. We got to find a way to let everybody have a lunch, or we're going to have to fight everybody or run from people. And so poverty has been an economic problem.
I think Obama is doing what he can on getting, the key word is going to be rebalancing. How do we get Americans to save more and the Chinese to spend more and to rebalance our economy? And Obama's trying to grow our exports by a significant amount over the next 5 years. That's his strategy for getting us out of that.
Well, that's a Wall Street notion.
Well, no, but it's more than a Wall Street notion. It's more that, if
you studied economics. See, I don't know any better.
You call yourself a slumdog economist, right?
And what I think is, I just noticed, and I picked things up. Germany, just last month, Germany just paid off the last of its World War II debt. Last month. I think we got to go sit down with China and with Saudi Arabia and with India and with Europe, and we got to renegotiate this debt for the developed world like we did for the developing world.
That's difficult, though, because...
No, it's not difficult for Barack Obama. That's why God made him president.
It's that's the manifest destiny, right, in Obama. But it's difficult because we don't have the leverage that we once did, right?
Oh, no.
We're in debt to them.
Don't you kid yourself. When he went to China, he wasn't smiling and grinning, and he wasn't saying the same. China's got more social problems.
That's
when
true.
When I went to China, they sent me to meet with the Ministry of National Minorities. And here's a ministry in the government headed by a Muslim. And he says, look, he wanted to talk with me about our race problem. It was the same kind of conversation I had with P.W. Botha in South Africa in the 70s. How did you all do it? See, and he was he said, you know, you all had one or two big minority problems. We have 104 national minorities in China. And he said about half of them don't want to be Chinese. And increasingly, as China gets more prosperous, you're going to have more people kind of acting like Dalai Lama. And they need help in figuring this out. They cannot have a recession. They cannot afford, they've got to continue growing economy. They can't grow an economy unless we help them. By considering, I mean, we do have to readjust. But the Republicans on one hand gave us this supply side economics which said you could spend your way out of the trouble. And now that they're not in power, they want to become deficit hawks. See? I'm somewhere in between. I think that the one thing that's necessary for a global economy is economic stability and checks and balances everywhere. And Obama has the capacity to negotiate that deal if there's somebody on his staff smart enough to structure it where it's relatively fair to everybody. And I haven't seen the latter.
I wanted to share one story, and then we can open up for questions. Uncle Annie has really been a guiding light in my life and has tried to counsel me and play the contrarian role regularly. And this been in what I should do for a career, what music I should listen to. But the one thing I resist a lot, I actually resisted it quite a lot, is he says to me, Kabir, you come from the tradition of Indian, you're an Indian American. In your tradition, you have arranged marriages. You see, I think I like the notion of arranged marriages. And I said, what are you talking about? And he brought me over to his home one day, and he said, there's this great Indian girl down the road. I'd like to introduce you to her. And so we got in the car, and he locked the doors, and we took off. And while we were going down there, he said, if she puts on a sari and put some makeup on, she'll be a real knockout. So I said, okay. And so we went there, and we talked for a few minutes. We talked about India. I met the girl, and nothing really happened. I don't really have much game, and he knows that.
No, I don't. I don't.
But
I don't know that was it. But but what the point I was making is the way both of the marriages that I've been in, there were people behind the scenes scheming to put me in that place. And they worked. They were right. And I think that the alternative, a chance meeting at a bar or a health club or even church is dangerous. And that whatever we as a society are doing for marriage is not working. So why not let's think it through? I mean, we can do better than eHarmony.
But tell us about Coretta and
Yeah,
Gene.
well, I mean, this is the history of it. Coretta King, Gene Young, Juanita Abernathy all came from the same little county in Alabama. They knew each other. Martin, Ralph, and I didn't know each other. Martin met Coretta in Boston. Juanita was at Alabama State and Ralph was the preacher, and somebody hooked them up. Gene was in Indiana, and I was sent to a little town in Marion, the same little town in Marion, Alabama, as the pastor for a summer. What I didn't realize until we started talking, I had accepted a job in New York and was going to run with the Pioneer Track Club, and I was thinking about the Olympics. You know, that's always been a dream of mine. And my mother didn't want me to stay in New York for the summer. So she calls the conference superintendent and says, "Can't you find a job for Andrew down south? I'm scared of him staying in New York." Now this, my father and I, this was a year or so after my father and I had this blow up, and I hadn't been home for a year. So my mother was saying, "It's time for me to come home." And she calls the conference superintendent, knowing that the one thing I can't resist is a religious call. And he said, "This church has not had a minister in 4 or 5 years. If we don't get somebody down there to help pull this congregation together, the church is going to fold. I don't have anybody else but you. We really need you to do this." So I left my job in New York and decided I was going to Marion, Alabama. Not wondering what the hell am I thinking of. So, well, I get there, and as soon as I go to the first house they sent me to, I see a Bible underlined. I see a senior life-saving certificate on the wall. I was on Howard's swimming team. And I see a basketball letter. And so I asked the lady, "Who's this?" "My daughter's." I said, "You got 3 daughters, I understand." "Yeah." I said, "Which one?" "Oh, that's my baby daughter." I said, "None of them around." Well, immediately I said, "Uh-oh, I'm here to get a wife." And what I began to realize that Mrs. Childs, who became my mother-in-law for 40 years until before she died and my wife died, had been calling the same superintendent, saying, "Send us a preacher. And by the way, I got 3 daughters here, and I got to get rid of one of them. And so send us a nice young man." Now, the importance of that in the civil rights movement. I was pretty bougie growing up. I was overprotected from racism in New Orleans. And New Orleans wasn't a very racist place at that time. In Atlanta, Martin was pretty well protected. Gene and Coretta were exposed to the rawest kind of racism almost daily. I mean, their families were persecuted and suffered. They suffered personally. And Martin and I could not have done and quit if we wanted to. When they tried to offer Martin a position when he was at Riverside Church to come just for a year to take a sabbatical, it was Coretta that said no. So I was offered, I was in New York with the National Council of Churches. My family was very, very happy. My mother and father were real pleased. I had a house and a good, secure job, and I was safe. And then but it was Jean that when we saw the Nashville sit-in story, she said, "It's time for us to go back home." And so I quit my job, sold my house, and went back south with no job and no house and 3 children. But it all worked out. And if we had not married those kind of women, we wouldn't have had a civil rights movement. And I think that's why I say I put my hope in Michelle. I mean, look at Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin. You know, look at Hillary and Bill. Even look at the Bush women. Barbara and Laura were both, you know, very strong, and Nancy Reagan, you know, was a very important influence in their husband's stability. And there was never a cabinet meeting that Rosalind Carter didn't sit through. And she never said a word in the meeting. See? But, you know, there was power in that bedroom.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Please stand up, and I think we have a mic for you right now. Please say your name and where you're from.
Hi, Ambassador. My name is Wayne Curtis. I'm a full-time student. But the question I really have, it goes back to what I think you ended on, and it came up yesterday at the 7 billion, and I apologize for blowing the title yesterday, here at the Aspen Institute, the importance of advancing the gender and education issues, particularly women around the world. So if you talk about the leaders that were influenced you, women, influencing Franklin D. Roosevelt, what do you think what are we going to do to really advance education for women around the world so that they can influence more leaders and have more balanced thinking? Because that gets back to your economics when you look at Bangladesh, Grameen Bank, and microfinance and the such. So,
yeah, you do, but if none of that would have meant much, there would, I mean, we wouldn't have had a civil rights movement if Eisenhower hadn't built expressways. If we hadn't had the railroads, we would never have stopped. I mean, the problem in all the cowboy pictures we used to go see about the settlers and the cattlemen fighting, that's what Darfur is all about, in part. You know, I mean, there's some problems that can only be settled by infrastructure. And as you have infrastructure, you will have women getting educated. But if women, now, you can check Rwanda. Rwanda is a government that wrote a new constitution. Nobody can win. Everybody gets 50% of the vote and 50% of the appointments. And the election is as a referendum on ideas. The only requirement is that each party has a minimum of 30% female appointments. They ended up with a government that's 48% female. It might now be 50-some% female. But women are running Rwanda. But without infrastructure, see, without jobs, without an economic opportunity to go with that, they have a good education system there. But it takes more. I mean, I think churches do a good job of education. Private schools, the joint relationships between colleges in the U.S. and around the world is all good. But development requires infrastructure. And particularly Africa, because distances are so great. I was on an expressway across down Morocco. And it's a toll road, privately financed, built by Moroccans, but it stops at Marrakesh. And I said, why don't you take this on down to Dakar? And I said, I bet if you took this down to Dakar, we could find some Nigerians to meet you, and before long you'd have an expressway all the way down to South Africa, a toll road that would pay for itself, that would open up the resources, the trade, the commerce, the educational opportunity. And I said that it could be privately financed, as the Moroccan road is. And they said, we can't because of the politics. We can't get through Spanish Sahara because Algeria, we'd end up at war with Algeria. Well, that's why I've been trying to get the Aspen Institute to work with President Obasanjo of Nigeria, because he's got a center that he's built, and it's the perfect place. If he invited Morocco and and Algeria and the Spanish Sahara to come sit down there, you're not trying to work out a peace agreement or solve all the problems. You're just trying to get permission to run a toll road through that land. And Algeria has always wanted a road from Algiers to connect to Nigeria, but they want more than a road. They want a natural gas pipeline. See, because Nigeria is wasting gas. If they piped it on through to Algeria, they could pipe it on through to Europe and sell it a lot cheaper than liquefied natural gas, which they send by boat. The infrastructure would pay for itself. In Tanzania, we were trying to put a gold mine in because there was gold way out in the middle of the interior, and it just, nobody would bother with it because there was no water. And we put a 100-mile pipeline, water pipeline, but all they needed was a 12-inch pipeline. But we made them put a 30-inch pipeline. And they put a 30-inch pipeline from Lake Victoria down to northern Tanzania, but every village along the way had a spigot where they could get filtered, clean, fresh water for their village, and that pipeline pumped enough for the mining, but everybody along the way had clean water. With a development corridor along with natural gas, you'd also have to put water, fiber optic cable, and people could tie into it. If you found, well, they found coltan, which we have in cell phones and things in Ghana.
That was also your Middle East peace plan.
Well, yeah, the Middle East peace plan was, a lot of the fighting is over water. Well, send some water from the Nile Valley into Gaza to irrigate Gaza. At least you can stop them from fighting over water. And take the issues, instead of these big, long political negotiations, we did the Olympics that way. We did the Atlanta airport that way. It's what I came to call public purpose capitalism. You get the public to sit down and agree on one thing. So we don't get along with Henry County on, or even Fulton County on things, or DeKalb County, but the airport, we got along with them on the Olympics, because we weren't talking about anything but, will you agree to let us have this piece of land to put an Olympic venue? And we're going to pay for it in cash and leave you with no debt, and when we're through with it, it'll be yours. We'll leave it to you for your purposes. Well, we didn't get any no's.
So what was the idea for the Middle East?
The idea for the Middle East was the same kind of pipeline running from the Nile Valley, Nile River, into Gaza Strip, or a desalinization plant up there near Lebanon that would provide, and there's enough money and technology is improving. You could almost run a desalinization plant in that region out of solar energy. And solve problems one at a time.
I want to comment real quick on what you said on women. I applaud at many Asian countries, India, Bangladesh, Grameen, for lending to women these microfinance loans. But what you're seeing now is the increase in loans are going up, but also the rise in defaults are going up. And just on the Times the other day, there was a story saying that we need to watch this very carefully. We all know what happened with subprime in America. What happens when you give a lot of subprime loans to people in Asia and Africa, and you start to default? So this might be another bubble that we need to watch in the emerging markets. And it's not
for the infrastructure,
yeah,
as well,
and it's not just protectionism on capital flows. It's legal. Everyone in India says there needs to be better infrastructure. There needs to be better roads. But India is one of the few big markets that international lawyers can't operate. And before you bring in a lot of money and capital, these deals require a lot of legal expertise. So if you can't bring foreign lawyers who don't have a good legal system around it, you can't do big deals. So we need actually more lawyers in India with higher competency.
No, you need economists.
You don't need economists.
No, I'm saying that you have to work out the economics of a project and then you let the lawyers write it down.
Yeah, but these lawyers are like are a huge trade union, and they don't let Western law firms come in who have the expertise. Like when Shell wants to do a deal, they
I
want to deal with
guarantee
that.
you, if Western money wants to come in,
Oh, it's coming in.
yeah.
But the lawyers are fighting it.
But no, but if somebody can work out the economics of the deal, lawyers usually go with the money.
Lawyers have the
I
money
mean,
there.
no, lawyers. I mean, in the South, even the civil rights lawyers, a lot of their arguments were like in Birmingham. This is going to solve your economic problems. Discrimination is a cost for you, and this will ending discrimination will make public education better for everybody.
This question.
I do have a question. I've had the great opportunity to work with you for several years in Georgia through a lot of different projects. And having moved up here from Georgia, I'm going back to local issues for just a minute. 8 years ago, having lived in Georgia over 30 years, during the Obama campaign, things got quite angry. And my question to you is the race card still active in the South? Or is it a generational thing of our generation having a more challenging time adjusting? Do you see progressive change in the South?
Well, I do see a lot of progressive change in the South, but race is still a major factor. But in more subtle ways. For instance, nobody would argue about a black quarterback anymore. Auburn and Mississippi and Florida are fighting over the black quarterback, you know.
OSU.
But in terms of selective indictments, I mean, we had in terms of affirmative action in the school system, DeKalb County school system, a school superintendent is being indicted because the wife of, the cousin of somebody on his staff got a contract to renovate a school. Well, in the small, well, it's not small, but I'm saying that every time I made a decision in Atlanta that Herman Russell won the bid, I got sued. And I never talked to Herman about any business. We had been friends in the civil rights movement, but I cut our relationship completely. But when he got the contract to win City Hall, even though his bid was $30 million and the next highest bid was $34.5 million, they sued me to give it to him because he was my friend. And we didn't win that suit until we got up to the Court of Appeals. Now, all of the Court of Appeals level are Bush appointees. And I don't know that the present mayor could win at the Court of Appeals, and he probably couldn't win at the Supreme Court anymore. So we still need lawyers for some things.
One more.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, I really appreciate the speech. I hope that the Aspen Institute had sense enough to record what you're saying. I do have two criticisms. One is you forgot to mention that when you lived in that my wife's father was your doctor, Dr. Harden. And so I knew about you long time ago. Secondly, I wish this meeting had been yesterday rather than today, because this morning I wrote a letter to the President of the United States in which I said if you'll reread Alexander Hamilton, you'll find out that all our founding fathers thought that basically the United States would be a capitalist society and government would do regulation and do the armed forces. That it hasn't turned out that way, because now the government is doing a lot of things that ought not to do. When I was just before I was Secretary of Transportation, I'm pretty sure you know this because I've talked to you about it, the Penn Central went bankrupt. The government solution was to set up Conrail and Amtrak. When I came along, I said, oh no, why don't you sell half of it to the Chesapeake and half of it to the Southern? Turned it down. Fortunately, when Liz Dole became secretary, that happened. And all I'm saying that what I told the president, that if this makes any sense, will you get the economists from the 8, 10 schools and really take a look at it and see whether more things should be done by the private sector, and the function of the government is to regulate rather than to operate.
No, I'd agree with you 200%, and I should say that this has been my mentor from childhood. Not only does his wife come and my family go way back together, he was the Secretary of Transportation, which helped us to relocate the Atlanta airport. And the Atlanta airport is yeah, but the Atlanta airport is right, but I should say that I ended up endorsing Herman Talmadge III as a county commissioner for Henry County and somebody said, how can you endorse Herman Talmadge III? I said, well, I came to Georgia in 1954, and I've watched it change. I said, along about 1979, 78, 79, Secretary Coleman and Maynard Jackson and I sat down with Herman Talmadge to get him to agree to put money in the federal budget to relocate an expressway so that we could keep keep the airport down south. And it was right thing to do, but it was the kind of thing that could have been a big political mess. And one of the other things we're trying to do is build up some young white people who understand politics, economics, and race and work together. And I've always tried to include, integrated development of leadership. We're not short of black leaders so much as we're short of white leaders. We've got to get people out of their comfort zone and get them across cultural lines and across international lines, because all of our problems are global now.
I want to just conclude, we have to wrap it up and then we'll do a book signing after this, but another Wall Street concept, which is leverage. And I know, I think it was Bill Gates who was speaking at the Aspen Ideas Festival. He talked about educational leverage. What would it be like if you could take Richard Feynman, the great physicist, and teach everyone, he could teach everyone in the world physics? What if you had the best teachers in science teaching all the kids science? And there's this great website called thekhanacademy.org, which I'm not affiliated with, but it's this guy who's just teaching people these great lessons. And I thought, if we could do educational leverage, what would it be like if Andy Young could teach us all how to mentor people, and we could form our own opinions and voices. And his book is an attempt of educational leverage, of taking the wisdom and advice of a great man and counseling many people for generations to come. So I hope you'll check it out. It's a great Christmas present. And Ralph Ellison writes that you can either live with live with music or die with noise. And it's been a lot of music working with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.